It's Miss Bishop. I'm one of the reading teachers at Whalebridge, and I'm ready to read you some poems from my favorite book when I was a little girl. I know, that was a really long time ago. Look at this book. It's so old, guys. Look at the tape. It's falling apart. But this was my favorite book. It has poems and it has some stories. It's called The Tall Book of Make-Believe. And I loved what was in it. I loved the words and I loved the pictures by one of my favorite illustrators named Garth Williams. And I'm going to read you a few of my favorite poems that I liked when I was little. Some of them rhyme, some of them don't rhyme, but they're all about using your imagination. You know that's what make-believe is, right? If you don't understand some of the words, that's okay, because sometimes words are like music and you just listen to them and kind of appreciate the way they sound, and maybe you'll figure it out later. Let me tell you a few of my favorite poems from this book. This one is called One Day When We Went Walking. This is about taking a walk with someone that doesn't have much of an imagination and how dull that can be. One day when we went walking, I found a dragon's tooth, a dreadful dragon's tooth. A locust thorn, said Ruth. One day when we went walking, I found a brownie's shoe, a brownie's button shoe. A dry pea pod, said Sue. One day when we went walking, I found a mermaid's fan, a merry mermaid's fan. A scallop shell, said Dan. One day when we went walking, I found a fairy's dress, a fairy's flannel dress. A mullein leaf, said Tess. Next time that I go walking, unless I meet an elf, a funny, friendly elf, I'm going by myself. Okay, let me see if I can find, whoopsie, poor old book is very torn up, but oh, I love it just the same. Okay, let me see. There's so many good stories. I'd like to show you this book in person someday. Oh, I loved this one. This was one about a tiny little person, and I just loved imagining that somewhere this could really exist. The Little House. In a great big wood, in a great big tree, there's the nicest little house that could possibly be. There's a tiny little knocker on the tiny little door and a tiny little carpet on the tiny little floor. There's a tiny little table and a tiny little bed and a tiny little pillow for a tiny, weeny head. A tiny little blanket and a tiny little sheet and a tiny water bottle, hot, for tiny little feet. A tiny little eider down, a tiny little chair, and a tiny little kettle for the owner when he's there. In a tiny little larder, there's a tiny thermos bottle for a tiny little greedy man who knows the woods of Pottle. There's a tiny little peg for a tiny little hat, and a tiny little dog, and a tiny, tiny cat. If you've got a little house and you keep it spick and span, perhaps they'll come to live in it, a tiny little man. You may not ever see him. He is extremely shy. But if you find a crumpled sheet or pins upon the window seat or see the marks of tiny feet, you'll know the reason why. Doesn't that look like a wonderful place to live? The tiny little man and the little dog and the cat. Oh my gosh, I love this one. Okay. Some of these are stories, but I'm going to skip to some of the poems that I like. Oh, I thought this poem was scary when I was little, and I loved it, and I even can say it from memory, but for you, I will read it from the book. It's called Someone. Someone came knocking at my wee small door. Someone came knocking, I'm sure. I listened, I opened, I looked from left to right, but not there was a stirring in the still dark night. Only the busy beetle tap-tapping in the wall. Only from the forest the screech owl's call. Only the cricket whistling while the dewdrops fall. So I know not who came knocking at all. I still got a chill up my spine from that from when I was a little girl. My goodness. This story, I loved this story, Bad Mousy, but I'm not going to read that to you today. It's a little long. I'm going to save it for another time. All right. Here is a very silly one. I can read this one to you. Now, talk about things that don't make sense. This is a poet named Edward Lear, and just like Dr. Seuss, he liked to make up words and make up silly things that don't really make sense to us just for fun, just to make people laugh. It's called Calico Pie. Calico pie, the little birds fly down to the calico tree. Their wings were blue and they sang tilly-loo till away they flew. And they never came back to me. They never came back. They never came back. They never came back to me. Calico jam, the little fish swam over the syllabub sea. He took off his hat to the sole and the sprat and the willoughby wat, but he never came back to me. He never came back. He never came back. He never came back to me. Calico band, the little mice ran to be ready in time for tea. Flippity-flop, they drank it all up and danced in the cup, but they never came back to me. They never came back, they never came back, they never came back to me. Calico drum, the grasshoppers come, the butterfly, beetle, and bee, over the ground, around and round with a hop and a bound, but they never came back. They never came back. They never came back. They never came back to me. I'm going to do one more out of this old book. And this is a poem that doesn't rhyme. You know, sometimes poems do not have to rhyme. Let me find it quickly. Here it is. When I Was a Bird. I climbed up the caraca tree into a nest all made of leaves, but soft as feathers. I made up a song that went on singing all by itself and hadn't any words, but got sad at the end. There were daisies in the grass under the tree, and I said, just to try them, I'll bite off your heads and give them to my little children to eat. But they didn't believe I was a bird. They stayed quite open. The sky was like a blue nest with white feathers, and the sun was the mother bird keeping it warm. That's what my song said, though it hadn't any words. Little brother came up the patch, wheeling his barrow. I made my dress into wings, and I kept very quiet. Then, when he was quite near, I said, sweet, sweet. For a moment, he looked quite startled, and then he said, you're not a bird, I can see your legs. But the daisies didn't really matter, and little brother didn't really matter. I felt just like a bird. So, the great thing about your imagination is that you can do anything you want. You can pretend